Welcome to the Women in Vinyl podcast with Jen DiEugenio, founder of Women in Vinyl, and contributor Robin Raymond. This podcast facilitates conversations with those working in the vinyl record industry to educate, demystify, and diversify the vinyl community.
Listening to the Women in Vinyl podcast, episode 22, and our first of 2022. That was Mambo, courtesy of Alexander Moskalenko, that was cut directly to an X-ray. Today we have a super cool topic and guest, Stephen Coates, a music arts producer and archaeologist of Forgotten Stories, and the man behind X-ray Audio. Stephen is here to share the story of Russian X-ray records, a forbidden culture, bootleg technology, and the human endeavor, a secret history of the people who made, bought, and sold them. Be sure to pre-order a copy of his new book, Bone Music. We have info in the show notes. And stick around until the end to hear a selection of these X-ray recordings. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you guys.
We are very excited.
The most. I apologize in advance because I feel like all of the fangirl that I have done to this moment is going to pale in comparison to the weirdness that's going to come out today.
Weird's good. We like weird. Weird is good. Yeah.
Yes, we like
steer to the weird. That's one of my.
I lean into it. Yeah, I fully lean into it. I feel like part of it is because I work by myself all day, so I just encourage my own weirdness all day, and then it just gets to come out in these beautiful podcast moments.
I mean, as a company, I made a Ouija shirt, so
yes. With our full support.
Excellent.
So for those that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how you found your way to X-ray records?
Well, do you want the short version or the long version?
The long version.
Yeah.
I want every syllable.
Okay. Well, the long version is, I've been a musician for a very long time, and I started to get invited to play in Russia. Right, and that was because I made a song with a Russian animator, and it was a hit in Russia. So I started to play in Russia, and about 8 years ago now, when we were there touring, we played a show in St. Petersburg. And my habit, probably like you guys, is that after every show, the thing was go and do a bit of shopping, right? So in St. Petersburg, we always used to head to the flea market. And they've got these crazy flea markets in Russia, and was wandering around a flea market and looking for records, and strange things. And I found both on one particular stall. I found something which looked like a record, but it looked like a very strange record. And my Russian friends, who would guide us and translate for us and stuff, they didn't know what it was. I've told this story before. The guy who stole it he was very dismissive of it. It was quite strange. He was like, like it was some piece of trash or something. You know what I mean? But I bought
like Canal Street.
Yeah. He was much more keen to sort of sell me some, military swag, which is what a lot of Westerners buy in Russia. So,
of course.
Or one of those dolls that they all fit inside each other.
A matryoshka.
Matryoshka. They're quite cool, but. So I brought it back to London and tried to play it. First of all, 78 RPM, but single-sided, very thin, and then the song was "Rock Around the Clock" by Bill Haley. Well, that's 1957 record, and so. But of course, the most striking thing about it was you hold it up to the light and you can see a pair of skeletal hands. It was, a record made on an X-ray. You got it there. There it is. That is the record. For anybody who's listening, you can't see it. It looks a bit like a sort of DJ or something, doesn't it? With her hand on a record,
Yeah.
So it it was one of those odd moments in life when you thought, I've got to do something about this. I've got to find out about it. And I had these questions. It's like, who made it? Why did they make it? And how did they make it? And at that time, I didn't know anything about this whole thing about lathe cutting and record technology. As far as I was concerned, records were pressed. So really, that's how it all began. And over the next years, every time I went back to Russia, I was doing research and trying to find out about it, and it kind of ate me. That's the truth of it.
Yeah, I know that feeling. That's how my Mistress of Reality page got started.
Right.
I want to know all the facts.
Yeah.
Well, we kind of very briefly touched on this in our Vinyl 101.2 as far as X-ray records and just history. But could you give us a brief history of when and why this came to be?
Right. So in the Soviet Union, Russia as it is now, these records were made by a kind of underground community of bootleggers. They wouldn't have called themselves bootleggers because that word doesn't exist didn't exist in the USSR. But they were an underground community of, first of all, music lovers, right, and scallywags, we would say, rogues, entrepreneurs, anti-establishment, and they built their own recording machines. They copied lathes, mainly Western lathes, but I found out recently there were lathes, official lathes in the Soviet Union. And they kind of bootlegged that technology. And then they discovered this sort of arcane method of actually using X-rays as a recording medium became known, and they started to do that. And the reason that they had to do it, bothered doing it in the Soviet Union at that time, was that a huge amount of music, popular music, was forbidden, for ideological reasons. And so the only way that you could listen to that music at that time was by making or buying these underground records. And so that's how it started in the Soviet Union. It did exist in other places, and we can maybe talk about that afterwards. But in terms of how I started researching it, that's where it really began.
Yeah.
Cold War, 1947, Leningrad, which is what we call St. Petersburg now, with a small group of mad music fans who were prepared to sort of do what it took to listen to the music they loved.
Yeah, including going to prison numerous times.
Yeah, exactly. It became a dangerous thing to do quite quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of like it. Music is protest, I think, is one of the most interesting things of that story, because it's, at times people didn't know what song they were getting. They were just rolling the proverbial dice and being like, oh yeah, well, here's 500 rubles, which at that point might have been their entire month's paycheck.
Right. So absolutely. So you often didn't know what you're getting. So when kids would go and buy these records off dealers on the street, and that's suppose the nearest parallel you could get, certainly in the UK, would be like going to go, because we're a little bit primitive here, you got to go and buy weed on the street, right?
Yeah.
Can't buy it in civilized cafes and stuff, right? So
Apple stores. They all look like Apple stores now.
Yeah. So it was a shifty business, right? And so you'd go up to one of these people that you knew was a dealer, and you'd be asking for like rock and roll or tango, which is Russian songs, or something like that. It wouldn't be like, you wouldn't be able to sort of flick through the genres or, select a particular artist. You might be lucky and say, Little Richard, and you might get a record and it might be Little Richard, but it was very random. And sometimes that obviously was, it was very disappointing when they got home and played their records. Sometimes it was enlightening, for Kolya Vasin, who was one of our main interviewees, he asked for a rock and roll record, and the guy sold him a record, and when he went home, he put it on his mother's gramophone, blue Jubilee gramophone player, and dropped the needle on it, and it started to play, and it was a Beatles song, and I mean it changed his life. I mean it transformed him that moment. He, when we met him, he was known throughout Russia as the Beatles guy. He devoted his entire life to the Fab Four. He lived in a kind of worrying grotto filled with Beatles stuff and dust and smoke. And he sat there as the self-proclaimed, minister of peace, preaching the gospel of love. And and that record changed his life. And I think that even though he was a bit mad, and there's something funny about it, there was also something very moving about it, because when I asked him, what was it about the music, this music, Beatles music, that transformed you so much, he said freedom. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like another world somewhere else, away from this grey, oppressive regime that he'd grown up in. And there was something magical about it. And there's something magical about music, right? I mean, and that's it, for all of us. It's at some point we've been transformed by a song, perhaps. And that was wonderful, But I think for us, because it is kind of inconceivable, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we've grown up in a place where, particularly in the digital age, where music is totally abundant and totally free. You don't have to pay for it, even if you don't want to. And
exactly.
When you can listen to anything you want so quickly. Of course, that's one of the reasons we love vinyl, because it curates it for you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right. But for those kids, one song was super precious.
Yeah.
And they would play that record to death. And of course, they were disposable objects. I mean, in a way, when I talked about the guy in the flea market, who was an old man, he associated those records with like street trash,
right?
Because you play it to death and then you throw it away,
Well, and because they were putting them in magazines at that point too. Like they were putting flexis, like the blue flexis, in Russian magazines, and they were like music magazines that were like propagating Russian culture and things like that. So,
well, that came a little bit later, but in the 60s in particular, with the magazine Krugazor, which was a sort of pop propaganda magazine. I love Krugazor. Right,
I've got a bunch of them.
They're amazing, right?
Yeah.
They're amazing things. So I think it's interesting that, because I think what happened there was that in some ways the authorities, by the early 60s, because don't forget the X-ray record started in the late 40s. Yeah. By the early 60s, when the actual X-ray culture was starting to die out because people could get hold of tape recorders,
right?
The authorities, I think that they sort of recognized that these kind of like objects, these flexible discs, were popular, right? And whatever they did, people wanted them. Yeah. So I think that one of the motivations behind Krugazor was to try and sort of like kidnap or absorb that kind of counterculture of the X-ray record, and make it official with a flexi,
Well, and why X-rays? Like, why was that the thing that was chosen?
Right. So, in my research, and there's a lot more about this in the new book, is that actually I think it originated in Hungary. Certainly or it might be one of those things that sort of pops up in different places at the same time. For instance, Italians would claim that Marconi invented the telephone, right?
Well, we claim to invent a lot of things.
Jen's Italian, and she takes credit for pizza all the time. She's like, I did that. I
invented pizza.
Pizza. That was me. Yeah.
Well, the Russians would claim that Popov invented it, not pizza. Right. So, but certainly the earliest references I found to it, and it was in Budapest, and there was an engineer, an audio engineer, and he wrote about it extensively. He also wrote an instruction manual about how to build a lathe. Yeah. Right. How to build your own lathe. But somehow, whether it's him or whether it's somebody else, people were experimenting with different surfaces. And it was an experimental time, the whole thing about like amateur radio. People were in love with this kind of new technology which was coming along. So there was a lot of kind of science clubs, and particularly in Russia, actually, in the USSR, there was science clubs, and that was kind of encouraged, fiddling around with mechanical stuff and electronics was part of the culture at that time. And I think people experimented, and the thing about X-rays is that they just have two things. First of all, they are very good, or they can be very good at taking the grooves. And the other big thing is that they were plentifully available. And in the USSR, everybody had to get tested. It was a bit like COVID, actually. I just realized everybody had to get tested for TB.
Yeah.
tuberculosis. So there was just hundreds of thousands of used x-rays. And because they were, this is geek heaven, right? But because they had cellulose nitrate in them, they were flammable. They can literally spontaneously combust. I've not seen an x-ray record spontaneously combust, but I would like to. Well, I think in the Soviet Union, it was like, don't do this in the hospital, because they'd had some big fires,
Totally.
I don't know whether they were necessarily caused by x-rays, but they'd have fires. So the people who worked in the hospital were told they had to get rid of them after a certain amount of time. So I think that they were pretty good at holding the groove, and you could get them. You could turn up in the hospitals after dark with, a few rubles or some vodka, which was a unit of currency.
Still is.
And you could make the deal, right? Before that, they were using. I've seen some discs cut on military maps, which were made on huge sheets, plastic sheets.
Oh wow!
Right?
That
sounds
next
cool.
grail. That is my next grail.
You've got to get one of those. I've got an image of one. We might even have one. But I think they either ran out of that stuff after the war, or it was a bit too risky to be caught using that stuff because it was military stuff. It's one thing getting caught with an X-ray, but if you get caught with like a map, you might be in deep trouble. So
they had problems with people wearing blue jeans, so you can imagine. Here is a map of Leningrad.
a military map of
Leningrad
as well. Or military map of London or something.
Yeah.
That was it. And the Hungarian ones are beautiful. They're often recorded on both sides. They're thick, wonderful. The sound is amazing. Still, right? The Soviet ones, they're not as nice. And as time went by and the material of the X-ray changed, they sort of got worse. Yeah. But the thing is that Paul, actually my colleague and friend who does the cutting, he's getting better and better at it. We use a steel needle.
Yeah.
But better to, the older the X-ray, the better.
Yeah.
So the new stuff, forget it, just ribbons. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you can get some older stuff, even from the 90s, it works better. Yeah.
I think earlier you mentioned how this was happening other places too, and that was really interesting to me because, through my research with, obviously it was later, but Master of Reality and all of that, there's a lot of really interesting Korean bootlegs with like Xeroxed covers and things like that. So what else have you found as far as other countries doing this similarly?
Right. So in the USSR, so obviously you've got Russia. So other countries within that kind of empire, Georgia, Armenia, sorry, not Armenia, is it Azerbaijan and Lithuania, some of the Baltic states, they were also people doing it. Ukraine, but not on the scale that they were doing it in sort of, Petersburg and Moscow and other places in Russia. But outside that, in the Eastern Bloc, various other places, I heard a little bit about it. So Czechoslovakia, but Hungary a lot. But it's really fascinating, the Hungarian story, because it's not about bootlegging at all. It's about archiving. And it started before the war with, I mentioned earlier this one particular engineer who became a bit of a mentor to a group of lathe cutters, basically.
Awesome.
And he was sort of teaching them how to build lathes and how to do it themselves. And they were those, people who were like in love with radio and in love with this sort of new technology. So they were using it to just make their own records from the radio, right? And in his case, he was commissioned by a woman who made an amazing archive. And in this story, there aren't many women actually in this story, in the Russian story. So one of the great thing about the Hungarian stories is that, there's women in that story. And Sophie Torok, who was a poet, she commissioned him to make a huge amount of recordings of her husband, who was a poet, and their circle of friends. But they weren't like, it wasn't an underground thing. These were to record what they were like, and to record music, the bands at the time, some jazz bands, for their own sake, just so that they knew what they sounded like.
I love that.
And so his recordings, and I tracked them down to various archives in Budapest, and her collection of records, which would have been amazing when the Soviets came to Hungary after the war. She, like a lot of other people, a lot of the lathe cutters there, destroyed their machines and destroyed their records because they were afraid that they would be associated with the previous non-communist regime. Right. So a huge amount of stuff was destroyed. Thankfully, she put hers into an archive and put it into the library, National Library, and said it hadn't to be opened for 25 years. So as a consequence of that, some of it survived. So that was exciting to go to that library and open the box, and the records came out, and a lot of them are sadly really sticky. You know, they kind of melted and stuff. So so that was, you know, that was like a different kind of X-ray culture. It wasn't about bootlegging. I mean, there's a little bit of that when, you know, because there wasn't censorship in the same way until it became communist. Right. And even then, I think, you know, people started using tapes and stuff. So it was really used as a recording medium, you know. Yeah. Even sometimes in the field, you know, I met an archivist there who was saying that they had some records which students would go out with portable lathes, which I've always thought's a weird thing because it's like they're so bloody heavy. And they would actually, you know, they were recording like folk dances and stuff folk music and stuff in the countryside. So as an archivist thing, I think because tape was so expensive or difficult to get hold of.
Yeah. Do you think this is sort of the gateway to bootlegging then? Yeah,
so that's it's a sort of unproved yet theory of mine that somehow that they developed that and then the word spread. And people would write about it, and you know, there's a lot of magazines then, like electronics magazine, amateur radio magazines, and maybe people were writing about it, and that's actually how the Russians bootleggers found out about it. You know, from maybe they got hold of a magazine, maybe they bumped into them in a prison camp. I mean, you know, it could be that. It could have been passed on by word of mouth. You know, so we don't know, but yeah, it was there seems to have been some connection there, you know.
I wonder if there's a Russian prison tattoo for bootlegging.
That would be nice, yeah.
I want to see what that one is.
I mean, so I know for a fact that because I've spoken to people who learned how to bootleg in prison in Soviet Union. I mean, they heard about it and it was passed on. It was like a kind of secret knowledge, you know, that was passed on. And of course, the Russian prisons, you know, must have been very unpleasant places. But at the same time, you know, a lot of business got done there, and people learned trades and stuff, you know, and learned how to be a better criminal, I guess.
Have you heard any really crazy stories about that? Like, is there one story that sticks with you as being just like the craziest of someone making these?
Of making the records themselves?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Let me think about it. Well. I mean, of course, it was fraught with danger, right? I mean, particularly as it went on. I mean, if you were caught, I mean, people often say, well, you know, if you were a kid and you were caught on the street with the X-ray records, you know, would you be flung in prison? No, but you would have your name noted, records be confiscated. Particularly if it happened again and you were, you know, you get in kind of trouble, you would be kicked out of the youth group. You would have your kind of studies affected, your career. You know what I mean? It would have that kind of effect. But if you're caught dealing, and particularly in the early years, if you're caught dealing and producing records, you know, you were in trouble. And Boguslavsky, he was one of the main bootleggers that I wrote about. He went to prison 3 times, you know, and the second time he was in prison, there was a library in prison, and he must have had access to various books because his ambition was not to make X-ray records, but to make black vinyl records, right? Well, you know, to press records, right? Effectively, he wanted, but not use a lathe, but to press records. So I heard this story, and I heard then also that he'd been successful and that he'd managed to do it. And I've seen some of the records that he made, and they were indistinguishable from Western records. And obviously, he could sell them at a lot more expensive. Right. You're going to tell me how this happens because I still don't understand it, right? So I was asking people, well, how did he do it? You know, and they said he built his own press at home in a shared apartment in Leningrad, in the bathroom, which wouldn't have gone down too well with everybody else who shared the apartment, I imagine. And that he was pressing these records by hand. And I don't really understand that. And also that, so the other question, of course, is where would he get the material to press them with?
Yeah.
So they said that he was buying records of Stalin and Lenin's speeches from the official record store because they were sold very cheaply. And he'd come up with a means of recycling the material. But you tell me how that's possible. I thought it's a wonderful story, but it doesn't quite work somehow. I don't understand it. And then I was in St. Petersburg about 3 years ago, and I met his son. And his son, I haven't got it here sadly, or I've got it, it's downstairs. He showed me his master. He gave me 2 masters that he made. He made galvanized masters and was pressing these records.
Yes.
So I mean, you're going to explain how he did that because I don't get it.
I mean, like, all I can imagine is that he would have somehow been able to heat them up and have a vise of some variety that could have like heated and pressed. I mean, because are they
that's what they said. They said they heated it up and the heat sensors they flattened out the grooves. You know. He was a bit of a technical genius, and he spent his time. That's what he spent his time in prison, doing, sort of working out how to do this.
I love it.
In his final court case before he went to prison for the 3rd time, because by the way he got caught doing this, was that part of his defense was that the sort of A/B test, because they couldn't tell which was the original and which was the copy by playing them, so or by looking at them. So obviously. Wow.
Yeah.
He was very good at doing it, whatever it was. His son Sergei told me that he was some sort of technical genius, and of course, even now in Russia, there's lots of people who are amazingly gifted in that way. But
and
I don't know.
Russians love pain, so they'll just keep doing something until they figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, that's probably in a way for me, that's the craziest story, Jen, because it just like how, and in a way, why? Because there can't have been enough money in it
Definitely not.
to do that, right? And then if you're that gifted, you surely can make more money doing something else.
Yeah.
And I think that, for him, this seems to, I'm not even sure it was the music. I think it was that the process. The process, but also deeply anti-establishment. And he wanted to make something that they could not tell that it was different than the original. So anyway, because he would have got in trouble for having the original. So why,
Right.
Anyway, so, but there's lots of strange stories like that, really. And, and about dealing, about the dealers on the streets and, what that was like. That was pretty dangerous.
Well, and that was one of the reasons that they tried to find a medium that was malleable, right? So that they could disguise it, and, put it up a sleeve or put it somewhere that was like easily disguisable rather than carrying around a big 12-inch record.
Right. So you can slip up until 25 X-ray records up a sleeve, either side. They used to also put them under the shirt, next to the ribs. I mean, in Russia, it's often called music on the ribs. Probably because most of the X-rays are rib cages, but
chest records,
also, the dealers would do it. Mikhail Farafinov told me that, his thing was that because he'd have a big stack of them, and he would use one of those things that, the things that you put on a tennis racket, like the sort of cover that you put on, or a squash racket. Yeah. So he would have his stash in there. And he'd hide that sort of somewhere, and then when people came up to him and asked him, he would tell them to wait there, and then he'd go around the corner and pull out a couple, because he didn't want to be caught by the police, obviously, with a huge stack of bootlegs. So that's it. His thing was a tennis racket, and he had a device where he could hide it under his back of his shirt on a piece of elastic or something, and whip it around the front, and
I love it.
Feel like a record.
Russian bootleg ingenuity. It's unmatched.
If I tried that, that's going to end in tears. That's going to end me with no trousers on or something.
Were these always like 7-inch size? And like, because I think people listening are probably thinking about Flexies and how you can fit a song on them. So were they always a song?
Yeah, they're usually between 7 and 10 inches. Quite often the 10 inches, yeah, because they're 78 RPM. So, but usually one song. We've got some very small ones too, and sometimes the Hungarian ones are almost 12 inches occasionally, right? But generally around about the 10-inch, like a sort of old shellac size,
Yeah. So I have an interesting kind of thing. So I have one here that they are a bunch that are now on eBay.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a ton of them.
And so I think, I don't know if you can see it, it's a skull. So someone who's buying these on eBay, and I mean, I think, there's a lot of people talking like, oh, I have an original, whatever. How would someone know, like, what is something to look for if you have an original or not?
How do you authenticate?
Right. Well, I get asked this a lot. So I have put a blog post up on the X-Ray Audio site, right? So most of the ones on the internet are fake.
Yeah.
I would say 80-90% of them. I mean, they're fake in the sense that they're not from the 1950s, 60s.
Yeah, exactly.
The first I'm going to now give the massive hint to the people who are doing this, because they are bootleggers in a way themselves now, right? So all in the same spirit. Don't put songs on after 1965.
That's always my biggest clue.
Doing it then, right?
Exactly.
So
that's how I know mine's fake.
Yeah.
Bowie put this song out in 77. There's no way that that's the real one.
I've got Pink Floyd songs, T-Rex songs. They're not, it's very, very unlikely. It's true that in some far away places, people probably still did carry on doing it after that, but they wouldn't be putting like an obscure T-Rex song on that. You know what I mean? So that's the first clue. Second thing is, if they look kind of smart or neat, and they're almost certainly modern, and because all the old ones, they look like shit, most of them. I mean, we've got some that are kind of like quite nice, but because they played them a lot, and they so they're pretty scruffy. They tend to be quite browny, and sometimes I've noticed that the new materials is more bluey, right? So that's another thing. But generally speaking, if it's got a very cool image on it, it's probably a fake. If it's something with like a dog tag on it as well, I've seen a few like that, almost certainly a fake.
Bullets. I've seen some bullet ones.
If it looks very cool, it's probably a fake, because it's just that, I mean, it's not that there weren't, the one I first found obviously is super cool, but they're quite rare, actually. A lot of them are blank, in fact. I've got stacks of blank ones, and Mikhail Farofnov told me that he preferred to record on blank X-rays because the sound quality is better.
Yeah.
So unused X-rays, right?
And I read somewhere on an interview that you did that they actually traced like plates for the size and everything of them. Yeah,
they get a dinner plate, draw a circle on it with a pencil. Pair of scissors, so
burn
that's
the hole with a cigarette.
Yeah, it's an interesting one that I really want that to be true, right? Because it's so cool, right? But as somebody pointed out to me, is that but you just said that they were getting rid of them because they were flammable.
Yeah.
So it's like, how likely is it that you're going to sort of stick a burning cigarette through the middle? I mean, several.
It's the proper size, so I mean,
it's the right size.
Yeah.
And also, they're producing a lot of them. That's a lot of rocketing of cigarettes. I mean, the Russian bootlegger was not a healthy animal, but I mean, let's stick it. I think it's such a great story. Let's keep believing it.
Yeah. Hold that thought. It's time for an Amanda fact.
The very first recorded sound was actually not playable at all. It wasn't even intended to be playable until very recently. The phonoautograph was more akin to an autograph of sound, or it was a sound writer, if you will. Squiggly lines that reflected the movement of a membrane from sound waves were actually laid out on glass with carbon smoke. At the time, and I should mention that kind of the time that we're talking about is 1860, it was considered that people might eventually learn how to read these squiggly lines, kind of like another written language. But these squiggly lines in 2008 were played for the very first time. And it was all made possible by a very, very fancy imaging system named the Irene machine. And yes, that's right, I said imaging system. These sounds were created from pictures. Really crazy, unbelievably high resolution pictures. There's an incredible computer software program that backs up these incredible images. And they actually can create sound from image. It's unbelievable. And they are actually using these images and sounds produced from them to resurrect and play sounds that were never made, were never intended to be played, and actually resurrect sounds from one-of-a-kind recordings that can't be played. Discs that are broken, dozens of pieces that have been sitting in boxes and archives for years, are now being played and researched for the first time in history.
So, Robin, what do you use to clean your records?
Well, I like to clean them, but I sure don't organize them. And I have count them, two incredible groove washer kits. One is our incredibly sexy walnut hand-carved women in vinyl brush.
It really is.
The other one is
perfect.
another one of their groove washer branded walnut kits. I mean, high quality doesn't even begin to touch it. They've got so much stuff for the care and feeding of your records. Go to www.groovewasher.com and you can check out all of the ways to clean your records and keep them in tip-top shape. There's stylus care, there's label covers, there's their incredible ultrasonic concentrate, so you can put that in your spin clean and get your records even squeakier and shinier. Groovewasher.com.
And now, back to the episode.
Yeah. But are you a prolific collector, Steven? Do you have?
I'm not a prolific collector. No, I mean I've got a medium-sized collection of oddities. So I don't like. I'm not a vinylist in the sense that I've got a huge collection of vinyl. I've got a huge collection of peculiar vinyl, not a huge, a sort of medium-sized collection of peculiar vinyl. And yeah, have you seen the cigarette card records?
I don't think so.
I should have brought some up upstairs. Little square records with the hole, which they used to put in cigarette packets.
Oh, that's cool.
Stuff like that. Have you never seen those?
No, there's some lathe cutter guys that I know that are making they're doing like 3-inch discs, and there's like some postcard ones, but I haven't.
Yeah,
I haven't.
I'll start posting some stuff. Yeah, so I've got some.
Cool.
I collect oddities. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's
awesome.
Great.
Yeah, strange records, and I love the what we call sound letters. The voice recorded letters and stuff like that.
I would love to do more of that kind of stuff as a lathe cutter myself. I've gotten I got my mom to go to my grandma's care home and record messages to my family. So I'm making like little custom 7s for my family. So
that's great.
Yeah. But I mean, I love that kind of stuff. And that's, I think, why like lathe cutting is so special. Like it's cool to, especially like in this time right now, to be able to like circumvent the pressing plant thing for people to get their records out. But like to make the feels records is what I'm all about. It's my favorite thing.
Well, absolutely. And I've just done, on my podcast, my radio show, I've just done this. The last one was about the self-made record, the voicograph stuff. But we had it here and I had to get my guest was Alan Dean, and he's an oral historian, and he makes this amazing point, which is that when those machines were first came available, and they had them here in department stores, like in the States, department stores, end of the pier, train stations and stuff. It was the first time that people had heard their own voice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's something magic about that, right?
And cringy, because if you've ever heard
hearing
yourself
my own voice.
Yeah, you hear yourself on the answering machine, and you're like, oh no.
Well, everybody thinks I don't sound that high, do I? Do I really sound that high? Because we all think we sound quite, quite deep, but
distinguished and timbered, yeah.
but when you got past, I think it was cringy, but it's also like, oh my god, that's actually what my voice sounds like. And in what you're talking about, that's what my granny sounded like.
Yeah.
And that was the only record at the time, right? So we take it for granted now, right? But
we do.
So I think it's something magical about that, and it because you do it right. I mean, when we do our live events, and we do the X-ray cutting, right? And our lathe is, we got a 1957.
I love it. I want to get a vintage one, like really, really bad.
It's it's primitive, right? And like I said, they call it portable, but it's transportable. I wouldn't call it portable. I mean, you get a hernia carrying that thing around. But when we do the cutting, it's magic. People, particularly young people, they're like, what? Somebody's playing, and it's going straight on. I mean, there's something magical about it still, right? Perhaps even more so now. I don't know.
You want to ask our question, Robin?
Oh, I think you need to ask the question. I ask the question all the time.
Nope, your turn.
Okay. So, Stephen, we ask a question that we don't allow anybody to prepare for ever, because then that way it's a little bit more authentic. So if you could create your own 7-inch record with anything on the A side and anything on the B side, what would that record be?
Right. Well, I would love to create a record with the voice of George Orwell on one side, because there is no record of his voice.
Wow.
He was as well as an author. He was the intermission guy for BBC Radio. The guy who talks in between programs, but they destroyed all the tapes.
Oh.
So I'd have that on one side, and I would put on the B side. Dang, that's so difficult.
Right?
Well, there's this, I think the Cocaine Song by Ayabella Bayanova from 1937, a song about being a cocaine addict in that part of the world, which became
rock and roll, right?
Of course was going to be forbidden because she was forbidden. But also they didn't even acknowledge the fact there was such a thing as cocaine addicts. So that record needs to be heard. In fact, it's going to come out. It's going to be on the flexi disc of our special edition.
Oh,
wow.
Baby. I mean, you're talking to two mega collectors now. Like, I'm like, oh, there's a zhuzhed up version of this that I can. Oh, great.
I thought you were going to say you're talking to two major cocaine addicts.
Yeah. I mean, as much as you might think that I'm fired up on a lot of things, it's mostly just being excited about life. So I promise.
Well, as we're sort of rounding out here, getting our time is about up, which is sad. We could go on forever.
Ever.
I do want you to tell us about, and our listeners, about your upcoming book, where they'll be able to find it, everything like that.
Okay, so it's called Bone Music. It's what happened with the previous book, which was a few years now, sold out, and also in the intervening years, we've been back many times and did a lot more research. And actually, we're not really got time now, but I did want to talk about this with you guys because the big thing that I really researched in the last few years was that these records, of course, there's rock and roll and jazz on them, right? Because that was Western music, but there's far more forbidden Russian music on them. And in a way, the really kind of heartbreaking story about these records in Soviet Union was that people couldn't listen to their own music, not just like groovy Western stuff. And that means, music made by Russian emigre singers. And I've sent you guys some audio, like beautiful stuff, Isabella Ureva, some amazing singers, Ayabella Nova, these wonderful songs, which were deeply loved by people. And, they were prevented from listening to them anymore. So there's a lot more about that and about that culture in the book. So that's why it's called Bone Music as well, in a way. Of course, the bones about the X-rays themselves, but it's like Soviet soul music in a way. It's the music of their bones, was also forbidden. So there's a lot more about that in it, a lot more about the culture. There's a lot more about the Hungarian story as well. And the sort of the stuff that we found out in the intervening years, some of the stuff that I've told myself, even in my TED talk, I found out later is not actually that accurate, with more digging and the truth, or maybe we've not got to the truth quite yet, but is more interesting. Do you know what I mean? It's not as headline as like,
right.
they were, like trying to smash the system with jazz and rock and roll. It's not as headline as that, but the story itself is far more kind of weird and wonderful, and as I said, quite heartbreaking. So there's more about that in the book, and more illustrations of some beautiful records and flexi stuff and sound letters, bootlegs made on records which were officially produced flexes, which you were meant to record voice messages on, but the bootleggers used them to record. So we've lots of examples of that. So
can't wait.
Oh yeah,
I'm excited.
That's it. It's long. May it continue and may it flourish.
Yeah.
May it flourish. Yeah.
On that note, I don't think it gets much better as a wrap up than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
No, listen, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, actually, thanks very much for inviting me to do it, and because I love what you guys do, and I think that I really hope that we get a chance to come over and we can do something together for sure.
Yeah,
it's happening. I'm
gonna
go on this fundraising train like nobody's business. Just buckle up, friends. Thanks for joining us on the Women in Vinyl podcast. You can join our ever-growing list of sponsors: other record labels, Selector, Couple Design, Eargasm, Groove Washer, Glowtronics, New Gen Audio, and announcing Vinyl Revolution Record Show live in your face and in your ears on March 6th. Join the lovely and talented Amanda Schutzman. And thanks for sponsoring the show. Hey, as always, you can join our conversation on Instagram or send us a note at media@womeninvinyl.com. Clock us. Send us info. If you have a question, we got the answer, or we'll find it. We won't lie to you. And check out womeninvinyl.com for past episodes, the store, the job board, and the library of resources. Don't forget to like and subscribe and give us a review on your favorite podcast delivery method. You can also contribute to furthering our mission at patreon.com/womeninvinyl. Hey, guess what? This episode, 45 minutes. There was more. You want more? You get more. Go to patreon.com and you can get more. And you'll find all the B-sides, the deep cuts, and the amazing extras, including longer episodes, and contribute to the creation of scholarships and educational opportunities to further the demystification, the infiltration of more women and non-binary identifying humans into the vinyl making space, decreasing those turnaround times every week. Yeah, we love your records. We want you to love them too. womeninvinyl.com.
This episode has been brought to you by Women in Vinyl and Red Spade Records. Thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe, and you can always contact us directly by visiting www.womeninvinyl.com.
Birdland, that's what I always hear when you sigh. Never in my wordland could there be ways to reveal